4,000 years ago, a civilization ruled the known world. It had the first professional army in human history. It had the first postal system. It had the first empire that stretched across multiple nations, multiple languages, and multiple peoples, all bowing to one throne. Historians call it the world's first empire. And then, within a single lifetime, it vanished. Not conquered by a rival army, not burned down in a single night of war. It was erased by something far quieter, far slower, and far more terrifying. The sky simply stopped giving rain. And when the rain stopped, an empire that seemed unstoppable crumbled into dust. Its cities abandoned, its people scattered, its name nearly forgotten for 4,000 years, until archaeologists dug it back out of the sand. This is the story of the Akkadian Empire. And this is the story of how the weather itself, the greatest enemy any king has ever faced. Before we go further, I want you to sit with one question. If the most powerful nation on earth today, with all its armies, all its wealth, all its technology, was told that the rain would stop falling for the next 300 years, what do you think would happen? Would the buildings save them? Would the money save them? Or would every single person eventually be forced to walk away, leaving behind everything they built, just to find water? Keep that question in your mind, because that is exactly what happened to the Akkadians. And by the end of this video, you will understand why so many historians believe the fall of this empire is a warning written in stone for every civilization that comes after it, including our own. Let us go back to around 2334 BCE. This is a time when most of the world was still living in scattered tribes and small city-states. In the region we now call Mesopotamia, in modern-day Iraq, a man named Sargon rose to power. His origin story alone sounds like a legend. Ancient texts describe him as a child who was placed in a basket and set adrift on a river, only to be rescued and raised by a humble gardener. From these humble beginnings, Sargon rose to become a cupbearer in the royal court, and eventually seized power for himself. But Sargon did not stop at ruling one city. He did something no one before him had ever done. He conquered city after city, uniting all of Sumer and Akkad under a single ruler, a single administration, and a single capital city called Akkad. A city so important that historians still have not found its exact location today, buried somewhere beneath the sands of Iraq. Sargon built something the ancient world had never seen before, a true empire, not just a large kingdom, but a structured system stretching from the Persian Gulf all the way up into parts of modern-day Turkey and Syria. He created one of the first standing professional armies, a force of soldiers who trained and fought as a permanent structure, not just farmers picking up spears when trouble came. He appointed loyal officials called Akkadian governors to run distant provinces in his name. He standardized weights, measures, and even the Akkadian language itself, spreading it across the region as the language of trade and government. Roads were built. Messages could travel faster than ever before. Goods flowed between cities that had once been bitter rivals. For a moment in human history, it must have felt like the beginning of a golden age that would never end. And for a while, it truly did seem endless. Sargon's empire lasted through his reign and into the reigns of his descendants. His grandson, a king named Naram-Sin, expanded the empire even further, and under his rule, the Akkadian Empire reached the absolute peak of its power. Naram-Sin was so confident, so certain of his divine right to rule, that he had himself depicted in stone monuments as a god, wearing the horned crown that was normally reserved only for deities. Imagine that level of confidence. a mortal king believing himself equal to the gods because his empire had grown so vast, so wealthy, and so seemingly permanent. The famous victory stele of Naram-Sin, carved to celebrate his military triumphs, still survives today, and it shows a king standing taller than mountains, taller than his own soldiers, a symbol of absolute unshakable power. But here is the lesson that history repeats over and over again. The moment any civilization begins to believe it is untouchable, that is often the exact moment nature begins writing its downfall. Because underneath all that gold, all those monuments, all that military might, the Akkadian Empire depended on one fragile thing that no army could protect and no king could command: rain. Mesopotamia sits between two great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. This land, sometimes called the cradle of civilization, was fertile because of these rivers and because of consistent seasonal rainfall that fed the farmland surrounding the cities. Agriculture in this region was not like farming in a rainforest with endless water. It was balance, enough rain to grow wheat and barley, but not so much that it flooded the fields. For centuries, this balance held steady, allowing cities to grow, populations to expand, and empires to rise. Then, around 200 BCE, something in the climate shifted. Scientists studying ancient climate patterns today call this shift the 4.2 kiloyear event, a period of dramatic, widespread drought and cooling that affected not just Mesopotamia, but civilizations across the globe at nearly the same time. In Mesopotamia specifically, the evidence is chilling. Researchers have studied a stalagmite, a mineral formation that grows drop by drop inside a cave, found far away in Gol-e-Zard cave in northern Iran. By analyzing the layers within this stalagmite, much reading the rings of a tree, scientists were able to detect a dramatic increase in dust deposits during this exact period, evidence of a massive, sustained drought that dried out the region for generations. Picture what this meant on the ground, for real people living real lives. Farmers who had grown wheat and barley for their entire lives, whose fathers and grandfathers had done the same, suddenly watched their fields turn to cracked, lifeless dirt. The irrigation canals that once carried life-giving water from the rivers began to run dry or clog with dust. Ancient texts from this era include a poem historians call the Curse of Akkad, and its words are haunting even today. It describes how the large farmland yielded no grain, how the flooded fields yielded no fish, how the orchards yielded no wine, and how the thick rain clouds simply refused to release their rain. Whether this poem was written as a literal historical account or a symbolic religious explanation for the collapse, either way, it tells us something powerful. The people living through this disaster understood, even 4,000 years ago, that the land itself had turned against them. As the drought deepened, it triggered a chain reaction that no king, no army, and no government could stop. Without rain, crops failed. Without crops, food supplies began to run out. Without food, cities that had once thrived on trade and agriculture began to starve. And starving people do not simply sit quietly and wait to die. They move. Entire populations from the drier northern regions of the empire began migrating south, desperately searching for any land that could still support life. But the southern regions were already struggling under their own version of the same drought. Suddenly, you had refugees pouring into cities that could barely feed their own citizens, let alone thousands of newcomers arriving with nothing. This migration crisis placed unbearable pressure on the empire's administration. Remember, the entire genius of the Akkadian system was centralized control. one government managing trade, taxation, and food distribution across many regions. That system worked beautifully when harvests were reliable. But faced with a drought lasting not just one bad season, but potentially a century or more of reduced rainfall, the central government simply could not keep up. Grain reserves ran out. Trade routes that depended on agricultural surplus collapsed because there was no surplus left to trade. Local governors, desperate to feed their own people, likely began prioritizing their own regions over loyalty to the distant capital. The glue holding this empire together, which had always been more fragile than it appeared, began to dissolve. And as if internal collapse was not enough, external threats began pressing in from every direction. Historical records describe increasing raids and invasions from groups living on the empire's borders, including people the ancient texts refer to as the Gutians, coming down from the surrounding hill regions. Some historians believe these outside groups were themselves being pushed toward Akkadian territory by the very same drought, forced to search for resources just like everyone else. A weakened empire, already starving and fractured by internal migration crises, was in no position to defend its borders as effectively as it once had under Sargon or Naram-Sin. The same army that once conquered city after city now found itself stretched too thin, fighting battles on too many fronts, all while the land beneath their feet continued turning to dust. Within roughly 2 centuries of Sargon's founding of the empire, and within a surprisingly short window of decades after Naram-Sin's death, the Akkadian Empire that had once seemed eternal simply came apart. This is one of the most sobering parts of this story. Historians describe this collapse using a word that might surprise you. Not conquest, not destruction, collapse. A rapid, significant loss of the complex social structure that had defined the empire for generations. Cities that had once bustled with trade and administration saw their populations shrink dramatically or disperse entirely. The great capital city of Akkad itself, whose exact location remains one of archaeology's enduring mysteries, was eventually abandoned so thoroughly that its very location was lost to history for thousands of years. Now, it is important to be honest and balanced here, because history is rarely as simple as one single cause. Many historians and archaeologists caution against saying climate change alone destroyed the Akkadian Empire. There were other pressures at play too. Political tensions between the ruling elite in Akkad and the local governors in distant provinces. Military overextension from decades of constant conquest and territorial expansion. Economic strain from managing such a vast and diverse region with ancient technology and communication. The drought did not act alone. But what nearly all serious researchers agree on is this: the drought, the breaking point. It was the pressure that turned existing cracks into total structural failure. An empire that might have survived political tension alone, or survived military strain alone, could not survive when all of those existing weaknesses collided with generations of failed harvests and disappearing water. What makes this story so haunting is not just what happened, but how long it took the world to understand it. For thousands of years, the story of the Akkadian Empire's fall was told as a story of gods, curses, and human failure. Ancient poems blamed the anger of the god Enlil for cursing the land. Later historians blamed weak kings, poor administration, or foreign invasion. It was not until scientists began studying ancient climate data, examining dust layers in caves half a world away and sediment cores pulled from ancient lake beds, that the true environmental scale of this disaster became clear. The rain simply stopped, for long enough and widely enough to bring down the most powerful empire the ancient world had ever seen. Nature does not announce its intentions with a declaration of war. It simply, quietly, withholds what civilization depends on to survive. Think about the layers of survival knowledge buried in this story. The people of Akkad did not have modern irrigation technology, satellite weather forecasting, or global food supply chains to fall back on. When the rain disappeared, their entire way of life depended on adapting immediately, on finding new water sources, on migrating to more fertile ground, on rationing what little food remained, and on communities working together rather than turning on each other in desperation. Some regions and communities within the collapsing empire likely survived far better than others, not because they were richer or more powerful, but because they understood how to read the land, how to store resources during good years to prepare for bad ones, and how to move the rhythms of nature rather than fighting against them. This is the same ancestral wisdom that allowed countless communities throughout history to endure famines, droughts, and brutal winters that wiped out entire civilizations around them. There is something deeply humbling about standing in the ruins of what was once the most powerful empire on earth, knowing that its downfall came not from a rival army with better weapons, but from something as simple, as invisible, and as unstoppable as a change in weather patterns. The Akkadians built roads. They built armies. They built a system of government so advanced that it became blueprint for empires that came centuries after them, and none of it mattered when the rain refused to fall. This is perhaps the most important lesson buried in the sands of ancient Mesopotamia. No matter how advanced, how wealthy, or how powerful a civilization becomes, it remains permanently tied to the natural world around it. Water, soil, and climate are not background details in the story of human history. They are the foundation everything else is built upon. And when that foundation shifts, even the mightiest empire can crumble into silence within a single generation. Today, when archaeologists walk across the dusty plains of modern Iraq, they are walking across the bones of an empire that once commanded absolute power over the ancient world. Somewhere beneath that sand still lies the lost city of Akkad itself, waiting to be found, still holding secrets about exactly how its people lived, adapted, and ultimately failed to outrun a drought that lasted for generations. Every stalagmite pulled from a cave in Iran, every sediment layer studied from ancient riverbeds, adds one more piece to a puzzle that took humanity 4,000 years to even begin understanding. The Akkadian Empire did not fall in a single battle. It faded slowly and painfully as its people faced a force no sword could cut down and no wall could keep out. So the next time you look up at the sky and see clouds gathering, or feel a season of rain arrive right on schedule, remember the Akkadians. Remember Sargon, who rose from a basket on a river to build the world's first empire. Remember Naram-Sin, who believed himself equal to the gods atop a mountain of victories. And remember that all of it, every road, every temple, every army, depended entirely on something as simple and as fragile as rainfall. Civilizations do not only fall to swords and conquest. Sometimes they fall to silence, to a dry wind, and to a sky that simply stops giving what it once gave so freely. If this story of humanity's very first empire, brought down not by armies, but by the weather itself, resonated with you, make sure you are subscribed, because there are far more stories like this one, still buried in the sands of history, waiting to be uncovered.